All right. Do you have to? You can probably just hold it if you want. You do this. Uh-oh. Mid-joke, yeah. Hey, Shake, wait. Do me a favor. Go out. Go clear out of that place. Get everybody in here. Thanks, man.
No shouting orders from the...
That was a request. I was asking a favor.
It was the Marine asking nice. I know. I know. I'm teasing him because I know that.
Okay, hey, I'll go ahead and start off here. Good morning, everyone. First, we're going to start a few minutes late, but we'll take our full 90 minutes here. First off, I think thank you in order to Dr. Lee, Carrie, and the CMR Center and the War College for continuing the dialogue with this group, because I think it's important work, and I think you're making a difference, so thanks for what you're doing. All right, for those of you I haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Reid. I'm a Marine. And I'll be moderating the panel today. For the last 2 years, I've been struggling as a director of our talent management personnel reform initiatives with some of the stuff we'll be talking about this weekend. And my job basically entails our personnel reform plans, our programs and initiatives, and our military personnel budget. And I'm definitely not the expert up here as the blue collar dumbest guy on the stage, but it's an honor to be up here with 3 really talented experts. And their full-length bios are in your program, but I'll just kind of walk across the stage here and introduce briefly a couple of highlights from each. Then I'll tell you how we're going to run this, and then we'll jump right into it. So to my left and your right, Dr. Risa Brooks, Chalmers Professor of Political Science at Marquette, a deep expert on those high-level civil-military interactions, the elite-level interactions between elected leaders in the executive and legislative branches, cabinet officials, political appointees, and our admirals and generals. And so I think she will tie in on some of the conversation that was just had with Ambassador Lute. I think it'll tie in very nicely, and I think she'll have plenty to say about it. And then we'll shift to Dr. Meredith Kleykamp, who runs the Center for Research on Military Organization at the University of Maryland, where she's a professor of sociology, also an associate dean of research and studies there. Ton of expertise on demography, and we'll talk about America's demographic fate, our demographic future as we think about Generation Z, Generation Alpha, who is available to serve, who wants to serve and is willing to join our armed forces. What do they think about the military? What do their parents and influencers think about the military and the value of military service and the value proposition? What do they expect from military service? I'm overpromising. Yeah, a big seller here. She's done a lot of recent work with RAND, and it's pretty insightful. But I think that'll inspire some questions and some dialogue back and forth. And then finally, Dr. Paul Scharre, who is the executive vice president, director of studies at CNAS. For a while, ran their program on technology and national security. And I would say Paul's a triple threat. So, a serious academic expert of modern warfare. He's also a policy practitioner. Early on in the Pentagon, he helped develop some of our early doctrine and policies for how to integrate these emerging technologies that we see proliferating on battlefields today that are really driving the changing character of warfare and how we were going to incorporate those into our schemes of maneuver and our military services. A work in progress, no doubt, but kind of got us off the ground. And then finally, the third leg of that triple threat, which is important, I think, to me, and it will probably be salient in the conversation today. He has extensive personal combat experience in recent campaigns as a highly trained light infantry soldier, which I think informs his perspective. So I think some of that will come out in the dialogue today. So here's how this is going to roll. Each of the panelists will give extended opening comments, and then we'll throw around some questions amongst one another up here. And then my trust contract with y'all is at least 30 minutes, and I think more, of open, unfettered Q&A. So sharpen your pencils, make notes of all the things you have an objection with or you want to drill down on, and take the gloves off and mix it up when we get to that point. And without that, I think let's get this train moving. So Risa, could I ask you to start us off?
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here
to talk about civil-military relations and to see so many friendly faces. As Eric said, my take on the who fights question is to look at the role of the civilian and military leadership. In particular, I'm going to focus on strategic assessment, so elite level interactions, as he mentioned. And just to sort of state what I mean by strategic assessment for this purposes, I'm talking about how the military and civilian leadership are coordinating and sharing information in the process of formulating strategy. And what I'm going to do first is focus really on what we know about what determines the quality of strategic assessment, factors that affect it based on prior scholarship and analysis. So I'm going to sort of go through and tell you what the different arguments and things that people have said about it. Then I'm going to draw on some of this to frame out some current and future danger zones or challenges that might be facing the US in particular, but also could apply to other democracies. So what makes for good strategic assessment, or what factors affect it? In fact, there's not just one answer, but there's actually at least three sets of answers to this question. And the first one points to institutional factors, or getting the institutional structure right, and the roles and authorities of different organizational subcomponents. In the civ-mil world, this focus is often orients or manifests in a discussion of things like gold, water, nickels. And you'll recall that those reforms elevate the chairman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, establish that person as the president's principal military advisor, streamlines the operational chain of command, putting combatant commanders directly accountable to the Secretary of Defense and the President, and then removes the service chiefs from the operational chain of command. Those reforms raise some questions that scholars have engaged, including how does that division of responsibilities shape military advice? So now we have a situation in which service chiefs are focused on readiness, training, organization, or all of those capacities. And they also have a role in the advisory process through their participation on the JCS. And how does that sync up or not with the advice that combatant commanders might give? How does that relationship affect strategic assessment? Sort of one institutional level question. How has the elevation of the chairman as principal military advisor over the service chiefs affected military advice? Now, one sort of set of arguments, which not a mainstream, but an set of arguments, is that it's actually been bad because it has suppressed competing views or diversity of perspective. Of course, the intent of the reform was to get rid of or minimize inter-service rivalry, but have there been unintended effects or consequences that have come from that? And then, has the chairman's efforts, or a chairman's efforts, to construct a consensus before leaving the Pentagon resulted in sort of a really new idea emerging, or more commonly, a least common denominator compromise? Also in the institutional sort of sphere, in that bucket, are those who focus on principal agent problems, or my own work on how intense preference divergence over policy and strategy between military and political leaders can prove pathological to strategic assessment. And here I'll give you one particular expression of how those differences, that conflict over strategy that Ambassador Lute also referred to, can be negative or distorting in military advisory process and in strategic assessment more broadly. And that is in the formulation and delivery of options. So when those preferences diverge, when they have different ideas about what strategy should be or what the military should be doing, let me put it that way, and there's a lot of uncertainty about resources needed for a particular option, if the military folks don't want to be intervening, perhaps they're talking about a particular conflict and the prospect of intervention, they might skew, given that uncertainty, skew toward really heavy resource commitment, estimates of that in their options, in their conveying of that. The example here is the early 1990s with the Bosnian Civil War, when intervention was really stacked against with the kind of options and the way that they were being portrayed by then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, in which he was talking about needing this massive commitment of forces, including ground forces, basically to do just about anything. Another sort of pathology or issue that can arise in the form of delivery of options might be omitting some of those options. And here you heard Ambassador Lute speak quite eloquently about this, about how all the options in the 2009 Afghanistan surge debate are counterinsurgency options and no really robust or even real mention of a counterterrorism possibility. Options might also be engineered, the constellation of them. I'll refer to my colleague Alice Hunt Friend, who's written about the Goldilocks dynamic. Go in, give an option that's really aggressive, one really mild, and then the one you want. And the example that she was writing about when she sort of framed that was the decision to assassinate Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard leader, under then President Trump, and that was supposed to be the option that wasn't taken, and it didn't quite work out that way. But all of these ideas of, that there's a pre-decision on what the options are going to be before elected leadership or even political appointees in the Pentagon are really given, have the chance to weigh in, suggests an agenda setting that's really not a healthy aspect of strategic assessment. My second bucket is to focus on the qualitative process of deliberation and the informal rules and norms that shape it. So how are the military and political leadership actually interacting? And questions in this regard are related to, on the civilian side, who's being represented at the proverbial table? Are the chairman, service chiefs, who's being regularly consulted, who's being marginalized? How much and how well does the civilian leadership engage with the military? Are they willing to brook dissent? Alternatively, do they defer too much? Backing up, how has the civilian leadership decided or weighed in on the choice of senior leaders? Because are they choosing them because they agree with them? Or are they choosing them because maybe they're the most talented among their cohort? And one can only imagine how these factors might affect the presence or absence of differences of opinion in strategic assessment and have some negative follow-on effects. On the military side, how well does the military leadership engage the civilians? Do they understand the very different style and considerations that civilian leaders may bring to that table? Do they understand how to engage in constructive dissent? Are they willing to do so? How do the norms of professionalism, again, echoing, it was a great setup actually with Ambassador, norms of professionalism on the military side, and by that I mean particular cultural conceptions about the appropriate role of the military in the advisory process. How do those shape that conversation? So is there a stay in my lane focus on operational level considerations consistent with this Huntingtonian separation of spheres? Or is there a willingness or capacity to engage in debates in that fuzzy space between strategy and politics? What is the culture and how is that shaping, undermining potentially strategic assessment? Are they comfortable with the possibility that domestic politics may enter into the debate, and how do they engage? Do they sit back and say, I'm checked out now, I'm done? Because, of course, domestic politics affects the sustainability of any strategy, and one can't really just think of those as extra military considerations. All one has to do is read the recent news coverage or the recent debates over the last several months with the passage of the aid to Ukraine to know that domestic politics is a fact that is not extra in considering military options. And then finally in this bucket are interpersonal dynamics. So if one talks to senior military leaders, the first thing that they talk about when they talk about their roles is trust and rapport and all of those dynamics, and how do those sort of interpersonal things, the lack thereof, then shape that process at the top. My last bucket before I turn to problems is to talk about something, and I thought about how to phrase this, and I don't have a great way to phrase it, so I'll just throw it out there, is sort of to think about the sort of quality and skill of the actual individual civilian and military leaders at that table. I think this is something that's not really thought about very explicitly. Things like, how good are civilian leaders at leading and guiding conversation? Do they have good analytical skills or insights? Are they receptive to new information? Do they regularly succumb to common cognitive biases? Are military leaders really always prepared to engage in strategic thinking? Do they understand and seek to check common inferential biases and pitfalls? Do they have good analytical skills? Do they fall prey to common cognitive biases? And I'll just sort of add a footnote or example here, which is, I think that this is something that's lurking, and it's for the political scientists in the room, an omitted variable, in that these sort of skill sets are shaping a lot of what's going on and affecting the actual outcomes of institutional or process-based theories in many cases. And I'll give you an example of a case where I think, or of a hidden argument here in this way. So many people take away Elliot Cohen's book about the unequal dialogue, about the need for that dialogue. But actually there's a hidden theory in there. And the hidden theory is that when civilian leaders are really, really astute and really, really smart, that strategy is better. And if you look at who he's actually studying, right, that I think is the bigger takeaway from that book, or a major. Yeah. So let me talk about some problems and pitfalls going forward. And I'm just going to pick randomly from some of my insights. And the last one follows from these ideas about sort of strategic thinking. And I can't tell you how much I really admire my colleagues in PME. And we wouldn't have this conference if they weren't doing excellent and amazing work in civil military relations. But one could still ask, are the institutions as a whole always prioritizing the right skill set? Are they really understanding, or are the skills to be a strategic thinker always being imparted as much as they might be? And I think this is also true for the civilian side. And I'm going to actually talk about something I did last weekend here. So I've been to Carlisle 2 weekends in a row, which is, I think, not that common for somebody who lives in Milwaukee, but it's wonderful. Last weekend I was here. There's a strategy competition, which is just amazing, and it brings together teams from PME and teams from civilian policy schools, and they're given a prompt. They work for 3 days. The prompt was about NATO and NATO strategy toward Ukraine and Russia. So that was what it was about. And so I come in with some other judges on the last day and listen to the final presentations. And one of the takeaways that comes from this, and I'll give you some examples, is that this idea of strategic thinking and what that really means as an analytical skill, I don't know if everyone is completely absorbing that. For example, many of the teams are really good at internalizing DIME and thinking about lists of things that the US, NATO, both of them were a little bit interchangeable. That's another conversation. But sort of coming up with these lists, but not always thinking about the causal logic through which discrete measures produce strategic effects. And I don't think means, I see means as a very passive kind of, it isn't really strategic. It isn't logic necessarily in the way that that's always interpreted. So I don't know if that's really getting us there. For those of you who know the term decision theoretic, that's pretty much what it was without a lot of strategic interaction. Another thing that I noticed is this tendency to think about, okay, Russia's over there. We need to impose costs to get them to the bargaining table, which is a good idea, important idea. But like, let's have a laundry list of these 15 things we're going to do to impose costs, and then thinking of the cost as sort of existing in the absolute and not realizing or thinking through the fact that costs are valued or weighed depending on the domestic political process in Russia. They don't actually exist in an absolute sense. And so one has to think about that explicitly. And this sort of common sense of some of the teams really hadn't even thought about what Russia might want, right? And if they did, it was extremely impressionistic. So I say all this to not sort of lay out dirty laundry, but to say we all have work to do, and it's not military, it's not civilian, it's both, because these are the folks that are gonna come up through that system. They're gonna be the political appointees in the Pentagon, some of those people, and these are gonna be our senior military leaders too. So anyway, that was a bit long-winded, but just to bring home the point, I think this is a real issue and something that I know a lot of people in this room really care a lot about. Breakdowns in trust, I worry about that too. So the political activism that we see, you know, I referenced Bosnia, this stuff that happens in the early 1990s, and we see periodically leaks to the press, public commentary, signs of weakness in the partisan ethic, not necessarily in behavior, but in belief and understanding of its importance. The attitudes of, so all of this sort of degrading trust. And how does this degrade trust? Why does this affect strategic assessment? Let me sort of make that connection a little more explicit. It does because a president, elected leader, political appointees need to be able to talk to their military counterparts in a candid way and not worry that some of that might end up in the newspaper. Because what is the incentive that's created if you think that could happen? It's to pick people that agree with you. And we can all see how that is negative for strategic assessment. Last, I'll say about this, attitudes of military exceptionalism. This is, so I've now, having spent a fair bit of time in my life talking to military audiences, I know what things push buttons, and this one pushes buttons. I know it does. And it's this, you know, to sort of, what do I mean by that? It's these, in surveys, the 25 to 30% of officers who report that the military writ large, culturally, is better than civilian society. You know, more moral, more patriotic, more disciplined, etc. And that there's actually been research that shows that people who express those attitudes about society similarly hold attitudes about civilian leadership. And I'm not talking about a particular civilian leader who might be worthy of critique. I'm talking about civilians writ large. That's deeply corrosive to the sort of ethos of positive, of creating a climate and an atmosphere of trust that's good for strategic assessment. Okay, I promise I'm almost done. Do I have like 2 or 3 minutes or should I? Okay, okay. So civilian politicization, I'm never not gonna get up on a panel and not talk about that because that's kind of my thing. And I'm worried about that and the sort of breakdown of democracy and norms that we're seeing, how that could also be negative. And let me say in 2 different ways why I think, how that could translate. One is increasing emphasis on partisanship in appointments, especially at the senior level. I think we're nearing a future, a possibility where senior military leaders are chosen because of their partisan affinity and expected, and some might even agree to, acting in ways that protect the domestic political interests of a president without voicing dissent or concerns. I don't need to explain why that would be bad, do I? A partisan loyalty imperative like this could be extremely, well, I will explain, really destructive to robust debate. And it's not just those that might be inclined toward that. It's all of the rest of the folks too that are going to worry about protecting the institution and having to not express worries or talk about how nefarious those dynamics are. It's that whole thing. And the second set of problems that politicization could create, which is just a lot of marginalization of the military. So the anticipation of dissent Could that mean that senior military leaders are pushed aside and not consulted, diminished in an advisory process? They receive orders, they act upon them as they should. And you get these really truncated discussions at the apex. And then just to sort of layer on the pathology, another pathology that follows from those dynamics is that these kinds of pressures could then lead the military to resort to kinds of bureaucratic resistance, slow rolling in implementation or sharing information. That's one of the follow-on responses, a logical response to that. And if that's normalized, that's deeply corrosive to civilian control, but also bad for strategic assessment. Last point. I worry about civilian inattention or conflicting priorities or just dysfunction in the civil-military relationship inhibiting strategic assessment. It creates the conditions for something that I call strategic backfilling. What this means is that what it refers to is when strategy emerges from the bottom-up decisions by military commanders in the operational and tactical domain. Essentially, strategic backfilling is strategy by default, which isn't strategy, right? Because you can have a remarkable accumulation of success on the battlefield, tactical victories, that don't cumulate to achieving any strategic objective. And we can come up with a lot of recent examples. I can think of examples, perhaps you can too, of why that's bad. I was going to try to talk a little bit about solutions, but I don't have a lot of them right now. So I think I'll just leave
Maybe
it
they'll
there.
come up.
Yes, and maybe we can follow up with that.
I have some doozy questions for you. But in the interest of, I got to make sure I keep my Tommy Callahan promise I made on the Q&A. So let's go to Meredith if you want to.
Sure. It's always a pleasure to follow Risa Brooks because you get to learn so much, and it's always, sort of the worst position on a panel to follow Risa Brooks because I will probably have many fewer and much less intelligent insights to offer. So I'm a sociologist. I was trained as a demographer. I don't feel like I act as a demographer, but it means I sometimes get to play one on the stage. And I want to say a couple of words about who's going to fight our modern wars, right? Anybody who knows anything about demography has probably heard the phrase demography is destiny, right? Demography is like a thunderstorm that's on the horizon. You see it building, you wish it weren't coming, and there's absolutely nothing you can do but maybe try to get yourself out of the way, but you can't travel fast enough, right? So it's sort of the impending, inevitable sort of structural hit that you're gonna face. The military knows what the demographic forecast looks like, right? It knows the thunderclouds that are heading its way. And part of what I've observed over the last few years are a lot of people sort of doing storm prep, but some people are buying lots of water and some people are, buying dehydrated string beans in their storm prep, to follow that analogy. And so our preparation for this demographic thundercloud is not well organized or coordinated. So the demographic reality that we're facing when we think about staffing a modern military is we are a year to 2 years out from the actual decline in size of the population that will be of prime recruiting age, right? I think 2025, 26 is when we actually start to have smaller cohorts at age 17 and below. So if you thought we had a recruiting crisis right now, wait until we start to have fewer people just literally in the age groups that we typically recruit from. I think the number of high school grads is projected to be down by about 10 to 15% in the next couple of years. That's who we're looking at. We see the consequence right now in other institutional settings of this decline in the number of young people. You're in Pennsylvania. I've just been, I'm a college baseball fan of sorts. My son plays college baseball. And Keystone College is like a really good Division III baseball program that's shutting down, right? It's closing. the university, it's trying to figure out, it's not a university, it's a college. It's trying to figure out how to survive. Many small colleges are shuttering, in part because of this demographic reality of fewer people who might be coming to their programs. The military is facing the same kind of reality, right? Fewer people might be knocking on the door. So how institutions that rely on a steady stream of young bodies survive and weather this demographic storm, really depends on how you read the tea leaves between what's happening with the supply of people and how you might shape that supply's demand to participate in your organization. On the supply side, declining numbers overall, also a changing composition of that smaller group, right? And in particular, as it relates to thinking about military service, we have a rise in immigration or people who are connected to immigration, either the children of immigrants, right? Sort of they may themselves be immigrants or the children of immigrants and have a different kind of cultural relationship to thinking about serving in the United States military. The population generally is becoming more racially diverse, a point I'll return to in a minute. We have young people whose the compositional attributes that they bring to potentially serving in the military are shaped by having lived through COVID, by having been educated in a system that looks very different than the way any of us were educated, and in particular, by experiencing mental health challenges, crises, et cetera, thankfully, for which they get treatment. But unfortunately, seeking and receiving that treatment has consequences later on, right? So the population looks more diverse in terms of the experiences they've had. We also have an uneven policy of legalization of substances such as marijuana that are not unevenly, right, taken account of when it comes to eligibility to serve. And all of this, this is not anything probably everyone in this room knows already, but when you combine that together, I think the estimates now are something that 20 to 23% of youth meet the conditions for eligibility to serve, right? We are below 1/4 of the population.
The current conditions.
The current conditions to serve. So that's the supply side, right? 1/4 of the population meets current eligibility standards. I was just at an event, and no attribution because I don't even remember who said it, but we sort of long had this lore that women were actually more likely to meet the characteristics to be qualified to serve than men, but that's actually now changed from what I learned, in large part because of mental health, right? Where women are seeking and gaining more treatment, and that's potentially leading to disqualifying. So, the men are back on top in terms of being more qualified. So that's sort of the supply side, right? What that has in practice led to recently is a sharp decline in particular of recruits who are white and male compared to the traditional trends and interest to serve. But that's not because of supply per se, right? There's people didn't stop having white children, who are male per se. What that's doing is probably reflecting a change in white male young person's demand to be part of the military institution. So I want to talk just a little bit on sort of the demand side. You have these young white men seem to also be distancing themselves from participating in the labor force in general, I know, technically we don't think of military service as a labor force activity, but, it is a job that you're paid for, and so it kind of is. But statistically, we don't define it as part of the labor force. So you have a retreat from labor force participation, and there might be a geographic component here as well, where, traditionally these are folks who are coming from both military families or the South. And we have some questions about whether there's equal levels of ability to meet enlistment requirements across, it diverges across the US geography, right? And military families are very familiar with the impact of electronic health records and now being flagged as potentially ineligible because of some of the medical services, mental health treatments you might have received. I'm going to speak about something that can be a little bit delicate, but it's a reality in this environment. And that is, I want to come back to the issue of the changing composition of the youth population and it becoming more diverse. The reality is, and if the population from which you're going to recruit becomes more diverse, you're going to have a more diverse military. We do have a more diverse military, right? On race and ethnicity. I think the gender diversity, our numbers are not growing increasingly diverse, right? We hover somewhere 14, 17, right, depending on the service and over time. But these issues of diversity matter for thinking about how to staff the force. We used to have an overrepresentation of African Americans in the military that dipped below. I think we're back up. In part because of this sort of trade-off where whites aren't sort of overrepresented. We have a rising share of the force who are Hispanic, but in reality in this country we have a rising share of the population who are Asian, African immigrants, and others, all of whom maybe numerically don't make a large share of the population, but who will into the future that we need to be thinking about. That also means thinking explicitly about what it means to recruit outsiders, right? To enlist, to go after people who may be first generation, who may be 1.5 generation, 0.5 generation, and what kind of message you want to tell out newcomers to this country versus people who have been here generationally. Because the message you send to the newcomer about why it might be so attractive to enlist in the United States military might be not such an appealing message for the people who are drawn to serve in the country to protect their families' legacy of being members of American society. Those two things can be in tension. And so you have to be really intentional about those messages and thinking about the fact that different audiences are going to receive the same message and maybe take different things away from it. And it also means once you get people potentially in the door, how you field a modern fighting force that's much more diverse. You have to be much more intentional about how you socialize, train, and ready them to work together. I think, I'm a sociologist. I think a lot about those socialization dynamics and how we get groups to work together. Sometimes I think we've given that short shrift as we think about just how to get people in the door, but we need to keep them in the door and we need to make sure that they work together effectively. I say this as somebody who, some of the research, I was up here recently talking about it, that suggests that, when I look at monitoring the future data, one of the data sources about high school seniors and their attitudes and values, one of the results that came out was that individuals who are propensed to want to join the military tend to have worse and less egalitarian attitudes about race than those who are not inclined or propense to want to join the military. And so as I think about that question as a demographer and the increasing, just the structural reality is the military will have to recruit very diverse populations. But the fact is the people who want to join the military tend to have less openness to diverse peoples that are unlike themselves. And I think that presents a real challenge for the institution moving forward, is how to take those questions about diversity very seriously. Because what I hear quite frequently as I, try to publish papers, get it out there, the peer review response from what I can tell is sort of a practitioner community is, well, you need to talk about how we might be driving away one of the reasons why we don't have so many white male recruits is that they are driven away by the narrative.
I'm sorry to jump in on this. Have you seen fidelity on that, evidence, or that's normally one of the things that comes up in Q&A at one of these things. Have you seen evidence to that fact, or is that?
I have not seen evidence of the fact. The revealed preference is sort of presented as, or this is presented as a kind of implied revealed preference for this. But I think because that narrative continues to exist and we don't have data or evidence to prove or disprove it, that's a problem for the institution, right? Because when you have something that needs to be sort of an imperative given the structural change in the population, you gotta address it.
Scholars, if y'all could get on that.
Yeah.
That'd be great, right?
So somebody here probably does have that data. I don't. But I think that is a real tension, and I'm cognizant that we might have sort of aspirations for who we think our fighting force is, right? And we also have to put people on the battlefield, and those two goals might be in tension here. But we need a way to resolve that tension and to be able to be transparent and honest about how we're resolving that tension. Right now, the current policy solutions are, my former colleagues at RAND would tell you pay and benefits, right? We'll just pay people more, make it more attractive, right? Increase the demand signal. I think there's also recognition about the limits to how much, and maybe this isn't purely a pay-based decision for many people, right? The limit does not exist for many people. You literally couldn't pay them enough, right? And so there's also sort of the idea that we need to change hearts and minds at home. Again, how we deal with some of the thorny problems that the military has continued to tackle and maybe not solve has implications for how well you can marshal a PR campaign. And here I come back to the issue of gender, right? Zero tolerance policy for sexual assault and sexual harassment. Is it? Does that shape, right, a narrative you're telling for women when they think about whether they want to join the military or not, or influencers, whether they want to tell their daughter that they should join the military? That's sort of one of the top concerns, right? So to have a PR campaign that talks about how great the opportunities are, you need to actually make sure that the challenges are reduced, and that they are truly perceptional and not based in reality. I think this is not my area of expertise. Well, let me say something. I'll leave my area of non-expertise for the last. The other thing, that matters here is influencers, and I think we heard a little bit about the idea of TikTok, right? We're gonna marshal TikTok influencers to try to encourage people to want to join the military. But the bread and butter influencers in young people's lives are their teachers, their family, their neighbors, and the people who don't have 2 million followers and 5 million likes on a dance video, but they're the people that they interact with in more routine and basic ways. And I think a recent report that I did that came out from my time at RAND showed that more than 50% of sort of a random sample from the American public, I think is 54%, said that they would discourage a young person in their life from enlisting in the military. But something like 38%, my own numbers, 28.8% would discourage someone from joining the military via ROTC or service academy. And I can't really tell you if that's because everybody is so sophisticated that they understand, the life of an officer versus an enlisted service person is different. My suspicion is it captures a lot of concern that people have that get your college degree first, right? The GI Bill is great. You can get your college degree after.
That idea that it interrupts your life and your life progress.
Precisely. But if you get the college degree first, that's what everybody's worried won't happen if you spend 8 years in the military and pick up a wife and 2 kids along the way, and then life gets hard and you're not going to go back to college and use that GI Bill. But it's distressing that more than 50% of the population of potential influencers here would discourage someone from enlisting in the military.
Can I jump in just real quick? And I want to get to Paul, and then we can open it up. But push back on this, confirm or deny. What I think I'm hearing is Ice Age is coming demographically. We got to figure out how to grow fur or hibernate or migrate. We've got to adapt to the situation to continue to do what we got to do, and embracing that rather than wanking about how kids these days are patriotic.
You're going to have the kids these days are precisely who you're going to have, right? And so you can complain about it, or you can adapt and adjust.
It's okay. I'm going to shift to Paul, and then because this is going to be a lot of questions about this thing here.
Sounds good.
The kids these days aren't that bad.
The kids these days are actually great.
They're just fine.
That's my take as a
Paul, you want to talk about technology needs, personnel? I mean, it kind of plays into a lot of what Meredith is bringing up. Over to you.
Sure, yeah, happy to. And what a great treat to follow such great experts and very thoughtful comments. So I'm going to approach this really from the tactical level and just sort of talk a little bit about who is fighting and what kinds of wars, and then how technology is starting to change some of what we're seeing in terms of the skills that are required. So I guess maybe to start, this question of who fights in wars depends a little bit on which wars are we talking about. So if we just look at wars underway today, you see very different answers to those questions. In Russia and Ukraine, a very traditional conflict, you've got people in uniform, they're conscripts on both sides, very different than the dynamic, for example, between Israel and Hamas, where you have with Hamas this non-state organization. And so very different kinds of approaches that are underway. In both of these conflicts, you see ancillary groups that are also playing a role either in fighting or as objects of the fighting that's occurring. So with Russia, the Wagner Group, the private military company, Russia's also, of course, pulling people out of prisons and using convicts as conscripts, or in some cases, I guess in some fashion, volunteers, if you will, for people that are out of prison. In the conflict in Gaza, there's a really interesting report that came out a couple weeks ago about how the Israel Defense Forces was allegedly using artificial intelligence to process information from social media and cell phone data and other forms of data to try to target people that were part of Hamas. Now, the IDF sort of refuted this claim, and so it's really hard to know exactly what they were doing. But one of the interesting sort of elements of this was this idea that they were using algorithms to sort of draw different information from cell phone data and social media and other tools to sort of build this network analysis. And there was a sort of question about, well, how closely affiliated would someone have to be with Hamas to sort of be targetable? Now, there's sort of both a legal and practical answer to that. And there's sort of the legal question of how much is someone participating in hostilities before they're considered a combatant? And this is something the U.S. military wrestled with in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'll leave that to the lawyers. But then there's a practical question of what do militaries actually do? The allegations in this case were that at least these algorithms were casting a somewhat wide net in terms of who they were capturing. Again, the IDF has claimed that that was not true and that's not what they were doing. So we don't know specifically, but it does sort of raise this question that for some types of wars and some types of organizations that are fighting, sort of this line of whether you're a combatant or not, whether you're fighting or not, might be in fact quite blurry and gray. And people might draw different lines depending on who they are in the conflict. And then lastly, of course, we see in many of these wars that civilians, and this is of course not new, but continue to be objects of violence, particularly in the war between Israel and Hamas. Obviously, Hamas's attacks on October 7th, targeting Israeli civilians with some really horrific violence and attacks. And then in Israel's air campaign, an enormous number of civilian deaths that have been occurring in Gaza. And none of this is new, right? All of this dates back centuries or millennia in warfare. What I think is important to just sort of start with in the frame is that a lot of there's a lot of different kinds of answers of different kinds of groups and people that are fighting or caught up in fighting, depending on how a war unfolds. And sometimes, sort of for whatever reason, we can get caught into just a more narrow view, I think, in the U.S. defense establishment of what war might look like, or sort of who is or ought to be on the battlefield. And it's worth just sort of reminding ourselves that there's a wide variety of answers to this. So is anything new? Is anything changing here? I do think that one thing that is slowly changing is that technology is changing the types of physical and cognitive skills and attributes that are valued in warfare. I don't think it's a dramatic, abrupt change that's occurring. And in fact, the changes we're seeing now, I would say, are part of a long-term trend that dates back, over centuries or millennia in warfare, as technology begins to allow people to reach out at longer range and distance to attack the enemy, and through changes we've seen in the Industrial Revolution and today, sort of through digital technologies. But I want to talk about some of the things we're seeing specifically unfold a little bit. So if we look at the war in Ukraine, it has this sort of weird mix of World War I type trench and artillery warfare layered in with modern 21st century war of drones and electronic warfare and social media. And so those require different kinds of skills. So a lot of the things that we think of traditional military skills, being able to carry a lot of heavy weight on your back and operate a machine gun and fight in the trenches, those things are certainly valued. And we see states using very traditional forms to mobilize their personnel to do that. Ukraine recently lowered their conscription age. There was some discussion of then having a demobilization after 3 years, and they did not make it through the final bill. And so currently, once people are mobilized in Ukraine, they're basically stuck until they are killed or wounded at the moment. And so, and then Ukraine's putting pressure on men who are outside of Ukraine to come back into the country, most recently cutting them off from consulate services. If you're a draft age male in Ukraine, you can't leave the country. Women can leave. So a lot of those look like kind of traditional tools. At the same time, they are training an enormous number of drone pilots. I was just in Ukraine a couple weeks ago and met with drone developers and people from the armed forces engaged in some of their drone systems. And just one group talked about they have trained 60,000 drone pilots. So a massive number of people piloting these first-person drones that sort of swoop in and attack the enemy, these kamikaze drones. That's a very different kind of skill. Now, a lot of those people are actually pretty close to the front lines because the communications are such that they can't fly them from long range. They're pretty close, and sort of by definition, if they have to be close enough to the front lines to operate their drones, and means they're also in the range of Russian drones. So they're not by any means out of harm's way. It's very different than the kind of drone warfare that, for example, the U.S. Air Force has conducted over the last 20 years with people sitting in the United States flying drones somewhere else around the world. In this case, they are close to the front lines and they're sort of harm's way. But the skill set that's needed is very different. They're piloting these drones and maneuvering them, and there's a premium on skilled pilots to do this. Some of the technology is then changing how people develop and acquire skills. They're using a heavy use of simulators to train people. That's something that digital technology affords in ways that wouldn't have been possible 70 years ago or so with aircraft in the same way. But the other thing that sort of this leap from crewed aircraft to drones is enabling is that you can retain the skills that you've built even when the platform is destroyed. So the survival rate of fighter pilots and bomber pilots in World War II was terrible, and so you saw a lot of casualties. I mean, you didn't have a lot of opportunity to build up long-term skills of pilots. That's different when you're talking about drones where the drone can be lost. Many of these are, in fact, kamikaze drones. They're just one-way drones. But the pilot, if you're able to avoid being targeted yourself, the pilot remains. You're able to build up skill sets over time. As we're seeing a shift towards sort of the next evolution in some of this is towards more automated features embedded in the drones themselves, that changes that dynamic even further, where not only is the role then that the human played, of course, different, and we're seeing more autonomy incorporated into drones in Ukraine today, in large part because of the jamming that's occurring. A solution to drones, I mean, shooting them down is certainly one solution. Another one is you jam the communications link, and that renders the drone useless if it's remotely piloted. And so the countermeasure there is more autonomy. And we're seeing both sides add more autonomy into their drones so they can operate even if the communications link is jammed. Now, we're pretty early stages of that evolution of seeing more autonomy and AI embedded into drones and eventually other robotic vehicles under sea and on land. But what that will also yield is a dynamic where once the skill set is embedded into the software, it can be replicated and at essentially zero cost across multiple platforms very easily. And so the marginal cost of replicating that skill set is much lower than the marginal cost of building a new platform, which you still have to build, and certainly way different than thinking about the cost of training a new pilot. Whereas you can have the most skilled drone pilot in the world, but they don't scale, right? If you want to train 20,000 of those really skilled pilots, it takes a long time, and it takes a lot of people, and it takes a lot of training to get there, and unless a lot of real-world battlefield experience. But once you have one piece of software that can do it, now you can replicate that much more easily across the force. And in fact, that's something that people are working on. So I think you're starting to see transitions in where some of these skills lie and then what skills are valued. I don't think fundamentally that transition is actually quite new. We've seen this sort of long-term trend in warfare where many physical attributes that once were valuable are less valuable today, and many cognitive attributes become more valuable. Certainly for tank drivers and submarine personnel and pilots, the types of skills that we need them to have are different than, say, light infantry, right? And they're much more cognitive focused skills than physical skills. I don't care how far a submarine officer can carry a heavy load. I care about that person's decision making and their ability to handle like a very complex piece of technology. And so that's certainly part of a long-term shift that we've seen underway. Even in sort of frontline combat troops, those skill sets have changed over the long term. We are a long ways away from a time when the skill set that you needed was the ability to swing an axe or a sword. And in fact, for frontline infantry troops, the ability to be very skilled with a rifle and shoot someone accurately at long range is much, much more valuable and much more lethal. But those trends are going to continue. And in the future, we're going to see the types of machines that people are interacting with become quite different. In the sort of space of AI and autonomous systems, the DoD has shifted to a paradigm over the last 10, 15 years that I think is very helpful, thinking about human-machine teaming. And not just with sort of crewed vehicles, the ones that, whether it's aircraft or ground vehicles that have people in them, and then robotic ones that are paired together, but also in terms of the tasks that are being done, a blend of humans doing some things and then user automation for some tasks. And we see this across a range of industries. Certainly tools like large language models are being used by computer programmers and others to automate various kinds of tasks. There's going to be a lot of advantages to militaries to bring in those tools and adapt them quickly and find ways to harness that technology. I think I'm much less concerned about like at sort of the skill level of the individual service member, their ability to use these tools. Because in many cases, they are. We don't need to teach a new recruit how to control a robotic system by using, video game controller. They're quite familiar with that. We're not going to need to teach them how to use large language models. They're probably using it, for their college assignments. And so, that's not going to be the challenge. The bigger challenge is going to be institutionally, how do we figure out how to bring in this technology quickly and how to use it in a way that leads to sort of the most effective joint human-machine kind of cognitive system. And particularly because that line is going to shift over time as the machines become more effective. And so building up sort of an intuition about what are these machines going to be able to do, where are they going to fail, is going to be very important for militaries going forward. The same way that tank crew personnel or pilots or maintainers have a very keen sense of the limitations of their physical systems that they're operating, we're going to get similar place with some of these cognitive systems. And that's going to change the types of skills that we need, the types of skills we need to train, and then institutionally, what we value and how we harness these people.
Paul,
Thanks so much.
great timing too. As we're transitioning to the audience, I think what I'm hearing from you there is really a diversity of skill requirements. Also, we've got some learning to do about what can a machine do, what should a person do, and how do we get them in, right? I note that the MEPCOM entrance processing standard for a Navy nuke and an Army Ranger are the same, right? So you make a good point of what do I actually need the person to be able to do on the battlefield? Should our standards migrate or adapt to allow that to happen, right? Hey, let's get this in y'all's hands. Let's turn it over to you. And I would echo a point that Carrie Lee made earlier, which is please frame your question in the form of a question. And we'll get started here. And 30 minutes of Q&A. And then what I promise here is a final thought from each of the panel members, like parting shot, one big idea in closing. We'll go speed round on that. Ma'am.
Thank you very much for this interesting conversation. I'm General / Dr. Wilmoth with the American College of National Security Leaders. So we were talking a lot about all the technology skill sets that we're going to need to have. We've talked about the shortage of the demographics and the fact that we have lower propensity to serve in individuals who don't meet current standards. It seems to me that the biggest barrier or the organization least adaptable to a lot of these changes might be DoD and their accession / promotion standards, knowing that Gen Z has a very different mindset of how they want to serve and what their interests are. So how do you see DoD, what do you think the appetite for willingness to change in terms of technology and generational differences? Because that's, to me, is where the rubber meets the road, and someone's going to have to budge. And we have a rigid promotion up-or-out system that's incompatible with Gen Z. So would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Does any of the panelists have experience with that? I've got recent actual
I was going
experience.
to say, you probably have the most
Yeah, so
experience.
sorry, ma'am, in my capacity as directing the Marine Corps talent management efforts, we deal with all 6 of the services and the leaders at OSD, sessions policy, compensation policy, and what I would tell you is we have right in the room, we have justification in the room to be hopeful of the sense of the Darwinian pressure that is on the department, right? I think it's still murky there's still institutional resistance, there's bureaucratic processes we have, the people running those processes are not rewarded, the incentives aren't right to change and to do something different. But some early indicators, right? They have a MARP program now that's reassessing like physical standards, and they're on their second iteration of that. They're taking a very deliberate, all my comments here today are my own and not the Marine Corps. In my sense, a little bit, shuffling and not really stepping out as much as we need to. But I think we will, if we think we're going to have the same standard for pot at MEPS 2 years from now, we're smoking pot, right? But also the skill sets of the drone operator kit I need. I don't necessarily care about the physical endurance, and I think the other thing that Meredith brought up, the health information exchange now and my ability to see your Adderall prescription from 10 years ago, we have to adapt to that. And they are in the process of doing that. It's taken too long. I think they feel the pressure, but I think it's an uncertain thing right now how we're going to do it. Yes, ma'am. Did that answer your question, Mel? All right. Yes, ma'am.
I guess I also want to sort of orient the question not just within DOD, but within the larger political climate. And that poses just an enormous obstacle to addressing many of the issues that Meredith laid out, the issues that of sort of change. Because what happens when, I mean, think about just the brouhaha of the Army changing, was it mission statement? Like the word, like
West Point.
West Point,
Yeah.
right, West Point, excuse me. You know, somebody feeling disgruntled by a change in the promotion criteria or that process goes to the press and says, oh, you know, you're favoring X group, or you're accommodating to Gen Z, you're not getting real people who've really done, you know, really deserve this. I mean, the politics of this are an enormous obstacle to the kinds of addressing really hard problems. And it really, frankly, just terrifies me that we won't be able to make the changes we need to, or to think creatively, or even grapple with the delicate issues that Meredith raised.
Yes, ma'am. Pending the next question, I'll readdress the aspect of that about promotions, right? So we're keeping colonels now till 33 years, right? So there's some legislative help to do that from extending folks on active service. All of the services have either completely abolished or relaxed the constraints on enlisted career force controls, right? The Navy just did away with them this year for the next 2 years. The Marine Corps ourselves, we have extended out so that we're not throwing away the person who has highly technical skills when they reach a service limit because of an up or out policy that's drifted from DOTMA down into our enlisted presumptions. And so I think we're trying to keep folks around for longer. And what we've experienced is, militarily relevant human capital is more precious because it's more scarce in this environment, and we cannot afford to be profligate with our policies at throwing it out when it's not ready. And we don't even know yet how. I mean, somebody should ask a question about BRS to these folks, but blended retirement, how that's going to affect us. Sir, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
Filibustering up here.
No problem. Dr. William Howe, Texas Tech University. Just had a question about, I appreciate the social dimensions that were brought up, especially moral superiority and some of the big data analysis. That's right up my alley of what I study as a social scientist. But I was also wondering if anybody's thought about or made plans for what's maybe coming as unintended consequences or aftershocks, if we will, using the language from earlier, of the last 20 years of war, and how we know that first off, a lot of people who join the military join from a military family, and then secondly, a lot of people, especially the Army and Marines, who deployed a lot to Iraq and Afghanistan and came back and had issues, their family, friends, and especially usually their ex-spouses saw that, and then now because 95% of my unit was divorced when we got back. And so then our ex-spouses raise our children, and then now we have 18-year-olds that maybe want to join the military, and they're like, oh well, I see a possible another war coming with everything going on. Don't join the Army or Marines, join the Navy and the Air Force. So along those lines, I'm wondering how the Army and Marines can position themselves in a way to recruit over, instead of just 40K, because the mom doesn't care about 40K if her kid doesn't make it back, right? So how can the Army and Marines differentiate themselves from the other branches to recruit against the other branches, and one, and then two, how can maybe that perception of how the mental, physical, and moral injuries that were suffered by Marines and soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, the military has done something to change those systematic issues.
Anybody?
I'm happy to respond to this. I mean, I think the concerns you're raising are very real, and I would not be surprised if we pay a price for those over the long term from a generational standpoint, that we crush the force to get through these wars, and we burn people out and families, and there's a real cost to be paid there. I remember conversations at the Pentagon at the time about what's the generational cost here in terms of propensity to serve with these service members' children, with their sons and daughters, given these dynamics that you're talking about. And at least the conversations that I was in, I think people were not very as fully attentive to this as they should have been. But I think it's I guess from what I said, it's part of a broader pattern of oftentimes what I see out of the department is being dismissive of the very real problems that service members face that then change their propensity to serve, whether it's sexual assault, right? Or there was just a report out in the New York Times, again, about traumatic brain injury from, in this case, mortar troops firing mortars. And like, you know, an institution that sort of puts its head in the sand about some of these very real things that affect service members that are going to then affect their willingness to serve or tell others. And, you know, the response shouldn't be PR. It needs to be to address those problems. And I don't always see the institution do that. I think that's a real challenge, both in the near term of the people who are affected, but also in the long term.
Risa, you got a comment, and then I'm gonna make one as well.
Sure. Sorry, I'm having issues with my microphone. So just to come at that question a different way and a possible solution, part of what's percolating is this sort of angst from a war that ended without a lot of dialogue about what happened outside of the veteran community. One of the ways that DoD can think about this, or senior military leadership, I would suggest, is to have more ownership and buy-in to actually studying what happened and thinking about that. That's such a powerful signal to those who were there that we care and we're going to learn something. And it's a way of healing. And maybe it's a way of addressing some of this angst and these grievances. And personally, I don't see that happening. And I think it's for complicated reasons why it's not. But there is a moral imperative beyond all of the organizational and other reasons to do it, to actually take some more ownership of that problem and actually invest in not just outsourcing like lessons learned, but actually internally invest in that process and signal that to the veteran population.
I'm going to take that a little bit while we're waiting on somebody else to come up. I'm just going to take that a little bit of a different place and apply it to peacetime, right? Apply it to now. Risa, this would tie back to the question I was going to ask you, although I'm a little bit worried about opening a can of worms. But the Army is small. The Navy is missing something like 18,000 ship crew members for the small fleet that we have now to be able to continue the ship operating days that we're operating at, right? The Marine Corps is on a 1 to 2 dwell permanent basis right now. In some sense, is there an imbalance between COCOMs and their appetite and their initiative and their ambition level and service chiefs who are trying to man, train, equip, provide, maintain readiness? Because from my perch, what I would observe is in a real sense, it seems like we're running wind sprints during the pre-K warm-up a little bit and exhausting ourselves. So we either need a bigger force, in the Enswain's means discussion from earlier, we might either need a bigger force or a reduced appetite. But from the COCOM perspective, nobody's getting a medal for doing less. And how does that play out? I don't want to open a big can of worms with that, but I mean, is there something to that? I think it does contribute to the level of stress on the force, if you want to call it that, or the pace we're running. You can't run 6-minute miles every year in your prep for the war and then be awesome and rested and ready to lean into the war, right?
I don't have a long answer to that, but I will just say that every institutional change creates new incentive structures and with unintended effects. And some of that, what you're explaining, is that the incentives of the combatant commanders versus the service chiefs are very different in their concerns. And that's a disconnect. And how do you reconcile that? Or how do you at least shine a light on that problem? I mean, talk about politically challenging problems. That one is, right? Because it gets a lot of equities into the mix. So yes, I think it's an issue and we need to be thinking about it. Did we scare all of you away?
No, we got.
Oh.
Sorry, go ahead.
Commander Michael Margolius, U.S. Army War College, Seminar 23, Carlisle Scholars. So the bluff question is the impact and role of media with regard to social media. And the background goes to early 2002. We're sitting in my office at home and watching a clip that was a day old of a JTAC in Afghanistan and thinking, oh crap, unfiltered, everything is going to start coming back. And there's what used to be combat camera, media vetted, is gone. And then we see with social media, the footage from the barracks with mold issues, things that are legitimate issues, and then the other social media impacts that are not necessarily legitimate issues that bypass the normal chains of command and get up to congressionals that maybe shouldn't. And then, sir, to your point about the, focusing on what's important, what's not, is so many distractions of what's not necessarily important at the time or is important but can't be tackled. And I'm just curious if there's comments on the press and how we can't direct them to have free will, but work with them to try to help shape that.
I'm happy to jump in this. I think, so there's a real desire of people in the media today, but I think in particular among younger folks, for authenticity, for seeing things that are real. And like social media enables a lot of that. And I do think that there's an opportunity for the military, if they were to harness these tools effectively, to like help a wider set of Americans who maybe don't, I mean, there's a lot of Americans who don't know anybody in the military, right? Mm-hmm. To see this is what the life is like, and people would want to see that, that probably TikTok video, right? Of what life is like in the barracks or what people are doing, done by the troops, rather than just the glossy commercial of the Marines slaying the dragon, which looks cool, but you're like, I don't think I'm gonna be fighting dragons, right? And so I think there's an opportunity there, but it's challenging. And obviously the military has been engaged in social media, but there's a culture clash there, and it's been, but I think there's an opportunity if they can harness that effectively.
Thank you.
Meredith, are we, from the propensity standpoint, just gut feeling here, is the military super awesome at social media outreach and leveraging that advertising mechanism to reach these folks?
I mean, this is not my area of expertise.
Oh, anybody,
but no.
really? Opportunity to excel, right?
But I think I think more about the traditional media than sort of social media and these kinds of things, and the dynamics with what issues get brought to the fore and what messages are conveyed. That still is, frankly, a lot of TikTok videos and Instagram reels are based on people's reaction to some form of traditional media. It isn't just people doing crazy dances and eating Tide Pods, right? And so what happens in traditional media still sets an agenda through these new platforms. And the one thing I would say there is we're all part of shaping what happens in that social media, right? Anytime a veteran is interviewed for a news story, they're shaping the agenda, right? Anytime a VSO representative is in the media, and this is based a little bit on my own research, where in the veteran community there's a lot of like, panic isn't the right word, but sort of like a lot of hand wringing about the idea of so much attention to PTSD and everyone's afraid every veteran's broken, damaged. Well, who's most frequently conveying messages that suggest veterans are disabled or have problems? It's veteran advocates, right? Because they're the head of an organization that's trying to get secure resources to help those folks. If every veteran's like your average Joe neighbor who's like all good and has no problems, nobody's giving you more money, right? They're giving you money to assuage a concern that you don't have what you need, right? And so that was going to be part of my closing remarks. But I think one thing that I think DoD doesn't necessarily sufficiently do is think about the fact that the veteran community and sort of the veteran issue space is part and parcel of the context of people making decisions. And it shapes propensity in ways that just giving, saying we're going to give bonuses is not. You need to think about how to integrate with that community.
So many
like
things.
We have two different agencies, right? So it's like, oh, that's a VA thing, but both parties are they're in a continuum of the life cycle of people who are connected to the military.
Bring it back to social media. We got a question coming down here. You get to be the last guy right there. Did you get your answer? You good? All right. Just bring it back to social media. I'm reminded of the content creator is on an equal footing with the Pentagon spokesperson when it comes to creating content that people see, and the number of soldier videos of complaining about work-life balance and my barracks is not fun and I hate this. Like they get 90, 100,000 views, or a sailor talking about how dirty the ship is. Like these things are probably more likely to be seen by a 17-year-old than the Pentagon press conference.
And maybe not my area either, but just to add to that, and there's also constituencies, both domestically and foreign, that are amplifying all of
100%.
that. So navigating all of that space means anticipating that and figuring out how you're dealing with that problem and neutralizing or addressing it. So.
Yes, ma'am. Totally. Sir, you get the last question, then we're going to close up here.
Lieutenant Colonel John Erskine from the National Security Policy Program. We had a bit of this discussion yesterday, and you've talked a bit about the military's challenge with preparing for the future based on culture, demography, and all that sort of stuff. But preparing to secure the United States is not just the military's responsibility. There's a whole of nation type effort there. We've seen we talked a little bit about it maybe not being a recruiting crisis, but more of a crisis of citizenship. And we've seen civics replaced with social studies, and we've seen kind of how the whole complex adaptive system kind of balances itself over time. What do you think the role outside the military is that for the rest of civilian leadership can have in helping resolve this issue? Because the military can't do it on its own.
You shouldn't ask me because I teach social studies.
But
And
I have
I
this
actually
shoe, I
think
will
the world
stick it
might
right
be
into my
better if
mouth.
we had a greater appreciation of some of the social studies issues, and the civics part would fall into place. So
But
that
that could be like legitimately, like how do we weave those things together, right?
Right.
Not so that we don't want mutually exclusive things. How do we weave it together as a nation so that the nation is prepared?
Yeah, so civil defense or an obligation of citizenship being larger than just, hey, military, go find somebody to recruit. Good
Right.
luck out there. Yeah. Risa.
I'll just say one thing, and this is just from my own experience and from my own institution, which is we really need to get into balance this sort of STEM focus. The way that I explain it to my students is there's going to be a whole lot of machines that can do a whole lot of technical stuff. The things that are going to really make you exceptional are your ability to think, your ability to talk to people, your ability to write, your ability to think about, all of those things. And so we need more arguments about that so that the resources and bureaucratic focus are on the things that are going to sustain us for the long haul within our citizenry. And the sort of skewed perception that STEM is going to solve all our problems, while important, not to discount it. My husband's an engineer by training, so I can't really throw that out. But there needs to be a larger dialogue about sort of and a better argument as to why these other things matter.
More follow over lunch. All right. Thanks. Hey, so we're going to bring it back in. I'll give everybody a final word. We're between everybody and lunch, but we're on time on our panel. And ma'am, I'll stay after class if I still need to be counseled once we get everybody out of here. So Risa, I'll turn it over to you for last word.
Okay, I'll just say one thing out of everything that I said that I think to think about, which is this idea of constructive dissent and what that means and how to do it. And I'm struck with a comment that Tammy Biddle, who used to teach here, once made to me, which was, it's not that the problem isn't that everybody doesn't think that's important. They don't know how to do it. And that's really stuck with me. How do you teach someone? Because it's a moving skill, right? It's different principle. It's a different civilian, different personality. How do you teach the capacity and also the sort of moral imperative to do it, and that bit. So I think that that's something really important for us all to be thinking about.
Yes, ma'am. Just a comment on that, and we can talk about it, I guess later if we need to in the interest of time. I was also struck by something you said about who's training the civilian political appointee to do that same stuff, right? We have a PME devoted to it. We're doing, like in the military, like,
Policy
you know,
schools.
yeah, we're doing our job, we're trying to learn, right? But is everybody who's gonna be on the other side of the table getting that same kind of investment?
And not every 5 to 7 years.
Yeah. Meredith?
I would cede most of my time to sort of reference my earlier point that I think when we think about, who's serving, who's manning, staffing, whatever the modern military, this is an entire life course that we should think about, right? We should think about all the sets of influences that come from, pre-high school graduation, also to what's happening to people after they serve and how that shapes, a feedback loop. And, I think what that implies is sort of re-upping a point Paul made, which is if you see things in the full life cycle, continuum, sometimes there are problems that actually have to be fixed. Like this isn't just a salesmanship, like you actually have to take seriously some of the things that go wrong for people and do better to make the pitch that the next generation is going to want to continue to be part of the organization and to keep our eye on that ball long term.
Thanks. So, I guess what I just closed by saying is that there are changes happening. You walked through some of them, Eric, but I would just say we need to expand the aperture of things that we're willing to consider. That our institutions are exceptionally conservative, particularly when we think about personnel policies and human capital. And there's a lot of, I'm going to throw out two just heretical ideas, right? That are hard to talk about in this space. So one is the draft. It's a dirty word, right? Now, I'm not saying we should have a draft like this moment, but if we look at the scale of violence unfolding in Ukraine, the U.S. Army would be remembered combat ineffective in a matter of months. Hundreds of thousands of wounded on both sides. So, there's no way to fight a war at that scale without conscription. There's no way that we could do it without conscription. We haven't had a serious conversation about that in decades. My colleague Kate Kosminski, who we talked to yesterday,
she's having a serious conversation.
But has a report coming out on this issue of draft mobilization. But we need to have some of these bold, maybe scary things on the table for discussion. We have at the core of our personnel. Here's another heretical one. The core of our personnel policies is an enlisted officer class divide. That is a legacy from the age centuries ago of British officers buying commissions. It makes no sense. It's a terrible use of human capital. That we take a fresh, person fresh out of undergraduate and stick them in a leadership position, tell them listen to the senior NCO and do what that person says. And then we have senior enlisted personnel that we really underutilize inside the force. And yet, that's kind of what we do because that's what we do. Right? And so if we're going to tackle some of these challenges, we need to be willing to start opening the aperture of things that we're going to at least think about and consider and question, are we doing things the right way and are there better ways to do it?
No, well said. I agree. Last thoughts for me, I think what I'm experiencing up here right now, other than the fact that from this perspective, it looks like church. You all filled in the back first, but is just challenging our paradigms. We're going to have to get comfortable asking uncomfortable questions because of the demographic reality that's coming at us, and hiding from it is probably suboptimal and irresponsible. We're going to have to figure out how to adapt in a way that's consistent with our national norms, our national values to have a fighting military that can be sourced. On the question of conscription, I know that there's a panel tomorrow, I think, with General Lasha et al. Are going to talk about that in some detail. I look forward to that. I'll close with our experiences in the services as I talk to the other talent management service folks. We are having to make a greater investment in entry-level training at folks because of this diversity of skill sets, this proliferation of technologies, this merging of domains. And that's causing us to need longer terms of contract on the backside, and it's causing us to need to keep our small units and our crews together for longer because there's a competency and a professional performance aspect of how a crew functions together. It's challenging our norms in the way we do it, and I think we're gonna have to come back to that. I appreciate you guys hanging in there with us. Let's go get some lunch. Please thank the panel. Thank you guys.